Welcome to the closer look for the 15th of November, 2023, the final part in our series on U.S. strategic posture and current threats. This is the agenda we've been working through in this series of closer looks, going through current strategic threats, other challenges, and at this point, we're going to get into U.S. posture and the necessary changes recommended by the IDA, whose material we have used quite a bit of in this series. Just to give you a quick summary of what we've gone through so far, this is the executive summary from the IDA report. It says the United States faces a strategic challenge requiring urgent action. Given current threat trajectories, our nation will soon encounter a fundamentally different global setting than it has ever experienced. We will face a world where two nations possess nuclear arsenals on par with our own. In addition, the risk of conflict with these two nuclear peers is increasing. It is an existential challenge for which the United States is ill prepared unless its leaders make decisions now to adjust the U.S. strategic posture. And as we went through on the agenda, right, we went through China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and then other assorted challenges as well, not just from a nuclear standpoint, which is what this report primarily focuses on, but we also pulled in information on, excuse me, chemical and biological warfare, on cyber threats, on AI, on social unrest within the United States, and things like that. So if you're interested in those, part one and part two is where you want to look. But let's jump into U.S. posture. What is the U.S. doing on a strategic level to combat these new threats in this new world that we find ourselves in here in late 2023? So, one of the things that is certainly concerning is that there's a serious removal from treaties, particularly treaties with Russia. So, we've seen the New START treaty disintegrate. We've seen the Conventional Forces Treaty as well disintegrate over the past year. These are both treaties that Russia pulled out of first, and then the United States slash NATO followed. So, right now, there are essentially no treaty-based obligations to keep the United States or its allies or unfriendly nations from initiating new nuclear tests, testing new ICBMs, et cetera. The Conventional Forces Treaty, which talked about and regulated military buildup near Europe's borders, NATO's borders with Russia, is now gone as well. So the era of treaties is more or less coming to an end. So the U.S. posture is certainly one that could be more aggressive based upon this, but we're not necessarily seeing that yet. Another thing is that the U.S. has been test firing Minuteman III ICBMs more frequently. This is intended to not only test the missiles themselves, but also flex a bit for the watching world. But we've had three failed tests since 2018. We're basically seeing about a 50% failure rate when it comes to our ICBM tests. So the deterrent effect is still there, of course. Even a 50% success rate on a massive nuclear strike involving hundreds of warheads is not going to leave an enemy country in very good condition. However, as Minuteman III tests fail about every other time, you're going to see a slight erosion in the deterrence effect that would have, especially if that rate continues to climb. But U.S. is posturing from a strategic perspective by conducting more of these tests, even though it's not going the way the United States wants them to. Here's another thing. We talked about Russia and China's rapid modernization in their strategic and nuclear forces. The U.S. Has very little coming in the way of new nuclear technology until at least 2030, considering that usually timelines for technology development in the military are pushed back multiple times. 2030 may be a bit of an optimistic time frame here, but the U.S. has very little coming in new nuclear technology in the 2020s, whereas Russia and China are both modernizing and rolling out new nuclear delivery vehicles, et cetera, pretty frequently. The US also has made a decision to focus on high tech production, right? So, focusing on additional radar systems, on trying to develop new laser systems, on attempting to develop new hypersonic weapons, which were lagging at least Russia and maybe also China in that area, and not necessarily low tech, right? Now, the silver lining here, if you want to call it that, is that since the war in Ukraine began, the U.S. has suddenly remembered that for a large scale ground war, you need a lot of low tech munitions, right? You need a lot of artillery shells. You need cluster bombs potentially. You need mines. You need all of these things, like what we're seeing being used in Ukraine. You also don't necessarily have to have the high-end, technologically advanced drones that the U.S. is turning out. Sometimes you just need mass quantities of small, lower tech handheld models, right, for surveillance purposes, for directing artillery strikes, things of that nature. So, U.S. continuing to focus on high tech more so than some other nations. But up until this year was kind of ignoring the low tech side of things that we're seeing play out in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Now, one advantage of focusing on high tech is that if you can pull it off, right? If you can develop these systems, get them deployed into a battlefield environment, your odds are slightly higher, unless your enemy has mass quantities of low tech. So I'll give you an example of this, right? It is true that having advanced fighters like F-35s is an advantage, right? This is a tactical advantage in a warfighting environment. However, even if your opponent has a significant amount of low tech anti-air equipment, for example, it's like not talking S-400s, talking S-200s. Eventually, if they have mass quantities of projectiles, they're going to take down that very advanced F-35. Another example would be it doesn't matter how advanced your troops are. If the enemy fires 100,000 artillery shells into the surrounding areas, your advanced troops with their advanced equipment are not going to go very far, right? So the U.S. focusing on the high tech side of things more than the low tech as a whole. And that just speaks to what the United States military believes is going to be necessary in the next conflict. But overall, high tech does not always defeat low tech, and that's something to certainly keep in mind. The U.S. posture also remains very focused on the nuclear triad. It's interesting that we talked about this in the report today. That China is attempting to build out these FOBs, these orbital bombardment systems in space that would allow them to basically fire nuclear or other weapons directly down upon an enemy nation, such as potentially the United States. The US is at least not publicly working on anything like that. Now, it's possible, but typically the US strategic posture is focused on the same nuclear triad we've had. Since we have had nuclear weapons, more or less. The B-21 Raiders coming out, the next gen strategic bombers are a big part of that. But the U.S. is more focused on upgrading the air portion, the bomber portion of the nuclear triad, and is more or less not making great advancements when it comes to the submarine launched or the silo launched weapons, at least not until the 2030s. So, kind of a typical traditional approach from the United States right now. Now, here's a huge problem. It's aging deterrence. The chart there on the right side, I think, is really eye-opening, right? So, for example, Minuteman III ICBMs, right? We've had three failed tests since 2018. Look at the end of original design life, 1980. Yes, 1980. These were not supposed to be in existence beyond 1980. And yet, for a very long time, for 43 years at this point. These have been constantly refurbished and pushed well beyond the end of their original design life. And you can go down the list, right? You can go down the list here and see we still have B-52H bombers out there. They were designed to be done in 1981. We've still got all types of weapons, Tridents, Ohio class SSBNs, etc. Really, when you get down to the bottom of the list is when you finally start seeing more modern nuclear weapons that we've deployed in somewhat recent times that are not past the end of their original design life. However, most of our strategic assets have been extended and extended again and extended again. And each time you refurbish them, you're introducing the potential for failure. You're introducing new elements, you're introducing potentially new equipment, you're introducing things that these systems were not originally designed to handle. And the result of that is often, as we have seen with Minuteman III failures. The result of that is a less reliable overall system. So big problem here. To put another bit of a finer point on it here, you can see the sea, land, and air leg systems here. Now, there are proposed modernized systems out there, right? You can see legacy systems versus modernized systems. So it's not like there aren't plans in place, right, to go ahead and upgrade these things. It's just that, for example, in the Sentinel under the land leg, the Sentinel ICBM is the one that's supposed to roll out in 2030. Um, all reports are that those systems are way behind schedule. When you start looking at the air leg, you look at the B-21 long range bombers, right? The Raiders. And we just conducted the first test flight, or at least the first publicly known test flight this past week. So you're looking at probably 2030 or so for that one as well. And you can go on through this list, right? All of these systems are 2030s or beyond, as opposed to our two primary global opponents, China and Russia, having already modernized their systems in the last decade or so. These transitions are expected over the next 30 years. I guess I spoke before I switched the slides because that's essentially the point that I just made, right? Russia and China have completed or virtually completed modernization efforts in the last decade, whereas we're looking forward over the next 30 years or so for ours. So again, I want to restate this. Deterrence still exists. Nuclear deterrence is still there, but it is increasing in unreliability or decreasing in reliability, to say it the other way. And our opponents are certainly taking note of that, especially as they modernize their own systems. Now, the IDA has necessary changes that it is recommending, right? The first is to develop and implement a whole of government strategy to address the 2027 through 2035 threat environment, which is primarily what they're focused on in this report. Also, it talks about must include effective deterrence and be ready to defeat simultaneous aggression from Russia and China. This quote, I think, is worth reading. If the United States and its allies and partners do not field sufficient conventional forces to achieve this objective, U.S. strategy would need to be altered to increase reliance on nuclear weapons to deter or counter opportunistic or collaborative aggression in the other theater. Now, that's a dire circumstance, right? You don't want to have to rely on nuclear deterrence. But what the IDA is saying is that there's a potential for US and NATO to not be able to field mass amounts of conventional forces. And then you've got to then adjust your overall strategy to incorporate more nuclear usage to deter that aggression. So not necessarily a rosy picture there. The third point on here is that the size and composition of nuclear forces should account for the possibility of combined aggression. So as opposed to deterrence and defeat using conventional forces, the nuclear forces need to be prepared, more prepared for potential nuclear deterrence or nuclear war with both nations at the same time. And I can tell you right now, having done a recent closer look on U.S. missile defenses, take a look at that if that's up your alley. It was just a few weeks ago. The U.S. has virtually no ability to knock down more than a handful of incoming nuclear weapons at any given time, right? We have the ground based systems, we have ship based systems, we have Aegis Ashore, we have THAAD. But when you take a bigger picture look, should China, for example, launch 150 or 200 weapons, nuclear weapons towards the United States, we would do well to knock half down. And that's just the facts of the matter, right? So it's not merely, and this is not in the IDA report, this is from our own research, it's not merely that the US nuclear forces need to be larger and that need to be able to have greater offensive capability. It's the fact that the US would not be able to defend against large scale nuclear strikes. It's simply not possible. We don't even have enough interceptors, physical interceptors, to knock down a major barrage from China or from Russia, not to even mention the fact that a lot of our interceptors would have questionable knockdown numbers. Current strategy is believed to be two ground-based interceptors fired per one incoming ICBM, which even more reduces the knockdowns, right? It may increase the percentage, but you're going to run out of interceptors really, really quickly. So defense, nuclear defense is very much lagging in the United States. Not to say that China or Russia are any better, right? It would be the same situation there. Full-scale nuclear exchange means that everyone takes dozens, if not hundreds, of hits because no one has the defense capabilities to stop it. The IDA also recommends a shifting and renewed focus on China, right? And the big question there is, can the US intelligence community focus on China, refocus on China as the IDA recommends, also Russia and Ukraine slash NATO slash everything going on in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, which, the war between Israel and Gaza and Iran and all of these other groups, and other emerging threats like North Korea. Does the IC have the bandwidth for this? The odds are very high that the answer to that question is no. So where does the IC turn to renew a focus on China? They have to reduce bandwidth somewhere in order to increase a focus on China. And given the global threat environment that we cover every day in the Hotspot report, that's not necessarily a great idea. IDA also says renewed focus on the likely critical 2027 through 2035 timeframe. That's what this report is addressing. So no surprise there. But let's talk about the odds of these things happening, right? So the IDA giving you a bit of a wish list there as to, hey, taking all these threats into consideration, here's what should be done. But you know what? Looking at the political climate in the US, we're pessimistic that these recommendations are going to be followed. Maybe some over time, over the next decade. But political leadership right now and leadership at the Pentagon, generally within the U.S. military and U.S. political system, changes are made very slowly, very, very slowly, especially compared to China, who tends to make changes very quickly. So because that is the climate, we should not expect any major sweeping changes. Now, if political leadership changes, if there's a major incident, for example, that looks like it could very directly lead to a global war or direct conflict, then you could expect an acceleration. But again, the US focuses on high tech, and high tech takes a long time to develop and deploy. The US needs a greater focus on low tech in order to win some of these potential conflicts, right? Also, right now, the odds of the US entering the next major conflict with our current systems are higher than us entering a conflict with modernized systems. And the reason for that is you have to first say, well, when is the next major conflict most likely? It's more likely before 2030 than I think most people would believe, right? If China delays to 2027, 2028, 2029 to make a move on Taiwan, it's going to face a Taiwan that is far more prepared for it than not. It's also going to have Taiwan's allies and friendly nations far more prepared, right? So the odds of something breaking out before 2030 in the Western Pacific are pretty high. Our analysis has been late 2023 through 2025 is the time in which the window is most open for China to move on Taiwan and begin a conflict there. Now, just because the window is most open in that time doesn't mean China will take advantage of it. But that is the ideal time frame for China, especially potentially just before, during, or after a US presidential election when there's a lot more political turmoil in the United States. You've also got Taiwan's elections coming up in January. And if those don't go the way China wants, then they may say, well, we're not going to be able to do this by political means. So blockade it is. You've also got the potential for a conflict in the Middle East to spiral, although I would say the odds of that have slightly lowered over the last 30 days or so based upon what Iran and Hezbollah, et cetera, are doing. You've also got the potential for a major Russian counteroffensive in Ukraine in early 2024, which we are predicting will happen. Depending on how that goes, you've got escalation on the menu potentially. So there are a lot of factors here. There is a lot of potential for the US to enter the next major conflict before our modernization programs, which largely kick in the 2030s, are completed. So not necessarily a rosy situation there, but that is those are the facts of the matter. And the facts of the matter is exactly what we try to present. So I hope you have gotten a lot out of this three-part series that we've just been going through. I hope they were beneficial to you. And as always, we sincerely appreciate your subscription and hope that we're informing your worldview in a unique and valuable way. Thanks, everyone, and we will see you next week.